Hey guys, tonight we are heading to Virginia. And before you say anything, yes, Virginia. The one with the traffic on I-95 and the historical markers every 3 feet. The one where half the towns are named after British kings and the other half are named after things that happened to settlers who probably shouldn't have settled there in the first place. But here's the thing about Virginia, and I need you to really hear this before your brain checks out and starts thinking about tomorrow's to-do list. Underneath all those colonial reenactments, underneath the tricorn hats in the gift shops, underneath the carefully manicured narratives about founding fathers and manifest destiny, Virginia is hiding some genuinely, deeply, uncomfortably weird stuff. Stuff that doesn't fit the story. Stuff that has stumped archaeologists, historians, cryptographers, and the occasional very confused government official for centuries. We're talking about an entire colony of 115 people that vanished off the face of the earth and left behind one carved word and no other explanation. We're talking about encrypted treasure maps that haven't been cracked in 140 years, with tens of millions of dollars in gold allegedly still sitting in a Virginia hillside. We're talking about bones that shouldn't exist in the places they were found. We're talking about stone tools in Virginia soil that are older than American prehistory was supposed to allow. We're talking about a sacred natural arch that 8,000 years of humans from completely different cultures, speaking completely different languages, all independently decided was the most holy place they had ever stood. Virginia is one of the oldest continuously occupied regions on this continent, and the older the place, the deeper the secrets. So dim the lights, turn on the fan, get comfortable, and let's go find out what Virginia is actually hiding. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a genuinely good time. We do this every single week. Ancient mysteries, forbidden history, the civilizational secrets that don't make it into the textbooks, all at bedtime. Because honestly, this stuff hits different at midnight when the house is quiet and the rest of the world has gone to sleep. You ready? Let's start at the very beginning, and I mean the very beginning, when European explorers and settlers arrived on the shores of Virginia in the late 1500s and early 1600s, they did not find an empty wilderness. I want to be really clear about this because the mythology of American history has spent about 4 centuries quietly suggesting they did. The empty wilderness narrative, the virgin land waiting to be civilized, the undiscovered country. None of that is true. They found a world. A sophisticated, organized, politically complex world, one that had been developing for at least 15,000 years before any European ship appeared on the horizon. Let me put that number in perspective. 15,000 years ago, the Roman Empire didn't exist. Ancient Egypt didn't exist. The pyramids hadn't been built. The earliest agricultural civilizations in the Fertile Crescent were still several thousand years in the future, and people were already living in Virginia. The earliest confirmed human presence in Virginia dates to roughly 15,000 to 18,000 years ago. These were Paleo-Indian peoples, hunter-gatherers who followed megafauna herds across a landscape that looked almost nothing like modern Virginia. The climate was colder, much colder. Virginia was at the southern edge of glacial influence, not under ice sheets, but cold enough that the vegetation, the animals, and the overall character of the landscape were completely different from what exists today, Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, American horses, camels. Yes, there were camels in Virginia, short-faced bears that stood 12 feet tall when they reared up. These were the animals the first Virginians lived alongside, hunted, and built their entire material culture around. The coastline was farther out, sea levels were dramatically lower during the last ice age, the continental shelf that is now sitting under the Atlantic Ocean was dry land. The coastline of Virginia extended maybe 75 miles further east than it does today. People lived and hunted on terrain that is now sitting under the Atlantic Ocean. Think about what that means archaeologically. There are sites, campsites, kill sites, possibly villages, off the coast of Virginia that are now 60, 70, 80 feet underwater, preserved by cold and sediment. Probably in extraordinary condition, we will almost certainly never excavate them. Whole communities, whole lifetimes, whole chapters of human history, underwater and inaccessible. What we do have are the sites that ended up on dry land, and in Virginia, those sites are telling us things that are making archaeologists profoundly uncomfortable. The most significant of these is a site called Cactus Hill in Sussex County, Virginia. We'll come back to Cactus Hill in detail later because it deserves its own section. What I'll say here is this. Cactus Hill contains stone tools that are older than they're supposed to be, older than the accepted framework of American prehistory said was possible. Virginia has evidence of human presence that predates the currently accepted model, and archaeologists are still figuring out what to do with that. Moving forward from the Paleo-Indian period, past the extinction of the megafauna, past the warming of the climate, past the transition from Ice Age tundra to the forests and rivers of modern Virginia, the human story gets more complex, more layered, and, in many ways, more mysterious. By the time the Archaic period began, roughly 8,000 years ago, Virginia's human population had grown, diversified, and become dramatically more complex. People were no longer purely nomadic hunters following herds. They were developing semi-permanent camps. They were exploiting the extraordinary richness of Virginia's rivers and coastline. They were developing regional identities, specific places associated with specific groups, specific technologies, specific ways of relating to the landscape. The woodland period, beginning roughly 3,000 years ago, is when things get really interesting, because that's when the mounds appear. The mound builders of Virginia, and they were multiple, distinct cultures across centuries, were not primitive people randomly piling up dirt. They were constructing monuments, monuments with sophisticated astronomical alignments, monuments that served as gathering places, burial grounds, ceremonial centers, and landscape markers in a geography that was as politically and spiritually significant to them as any map. The Adena culture, based primarily in Ohio, extended its influence into western Virginia beginning roughly 2,500 years ago. They buried their dead under large earthen mounds, sometimes dozens of feet high, with elaborate grave goods, sacred objects, tools for the afterlife, copper ornaments that had travelled hundreds of miles from their source. By the time Europeans arrived, the dominant political force in coastal Virginia was the Wahunsenacah, the paramount chiefdom led by a man the English called Powhatan, though his actual name was Wahunsenacah. The Wahunsenacah was not a loose collection of tribes, it was an empire, 30 tribes, 15,000 people. A tribute system, a military, diplomats, spies, a sophisticated economy. When the English arrived at Jamestown in 1607, they weren't stumbling into a primitive wilderness. They were walking into someone else's geopolitical situation. And Wahunsenacah had already been watching the Spanish. He knew what Europeans did. He had a plan. The plan, by the way, did not work. But that's not because he was naive, it's because the English were relentless in a way that even experienced political minds couldn't fully account for. Let's talk about the most important political figure in Virginia history. Not George Washington, not Thomas Jefferson, not Patrick Henry, Wahunsenacah, the man the English called Powhatan, the paramount chief of the Wahunsenacah, the most powerful indigenous political confederation on the Atlantic seaboard in the early 17th century. Wahunsenacah deserves more than a footnote, more than a cameo in the Pocahontas story, more than a brief mention before the history moves on to the English settlers. He was one of the most remarkable political figures in North American history, and the fact that most Americans couldn't tell you his actual name is a pretty accurate measurement of whose history we've decided to tell. Let's fix that tonight. When the English arrived in 1607, Wahunsenacah was approximately 60 years old. He had been building his confederacy for decades. And here's the crucial point. He hadn't inherited it. He had built it. The Algonquian-speaking peoples of coastal Virginia had no tradition of centralized political authority before him. There were chiefs of individual villages and tribes. There were alliances and conflicts and trading relationships, but there was no paramount chief. There was no empire. Wahunsenacah created one, tribe by tribe. Through diplomacy, through strategic marriages, through the strategic deployment of military force when necessary, and through the kind of long-term political thinking that most leaders in any era never managed to sustain for very long. By 1607, the Wahunsenacah covered roughly 16,000 square miles of coastal Virginia. It included at least 30 tribes with their own chiefs, their own territories, their own traditions, all of them paying tribute to Wahunsenacah, all of them recognizing his paramount authority. Think about what building that kind of political structure actually requires. You need legitimacy, a reason why other chiefs should accept your authority rather than resist it. Wahunsenacah built legitimacy through a combination of military success and spiritual authority. His position was not just political, it was cosmological. The paramount chief wasn't just a powerful man, he was the intermediary between the human world and the spirit world. You need economic control. Wahunsenacah controlled trade routes stretching from the coast to the mountains. Everything that moved through the Tidewater region moved through his network. You need intelligence. Multiple accounts from early English settlers describe how information traveled through the Confederacy with remarkable speed. Within hours of something happening at Jamestown, Wahunsenacah, who was often days' travel away, could know about it. And you need the ability to project force. Wahunsenacah could put several thousand warriors in the field. Against 104 colonists in a small wooden fort on a swampy peninsula, he had overwhelming military superiority. So here is the question that historians have been debating for 4 centuries. Why didn't he just destroy Jamestown? It would have been easy. In the first year, the colonists were dying of disease and starvation at a catastrophic rate. They were incompetent at feeding themselves, A simple decision to cut off the food supply, combined with a coordinated attack, would have ended the English experiment in Virginia before it really began. But Wahunsenacah didn't do that. Why? The most convincing answer, Wahunsenacah saw the English as an opportunity. They had things he wanted: metal tools, copper, weapons, a connection to a wider world of resources and technology. His plan was not to destroy the English. His plan was to incorporate them, to make them a dependent tribe within his confederacy, useful, controllable, politically subordinate. He almost pulled it off. The early years of Jamestown were characterized by managed dependency. Wahunsenacah controlled the food supply. When the English were starving, which was frequently, he decided whether to sell them corn. The English were in no position to refuse his terms. Captain John Smith understood this dynamic and pushed back against it harder than most English leaders would have. The famous story of Pocahontas saving John Smith's life is almost certainly not what it appears to be. Most historians believe it was a ritual of adoption. Wahunsenacah was symbolically incorporating Smith into his political family. In other words, Pocahontas wasn't saving Smith from death. She was welcoming him into her father's empire. Smith apparently agreed to the ritual and then ignored the political obligations it entailed. This frustrated Wahunsenacah enormously. Smith was injured in a gunpowder accident in 1609 and returned to England permanently. Without his leadership, Jamestown collapsed into the starving time. We'll cover that later. Pocahontas, her actual name was Matoaka, was a political asset in her father's strategy. Her marriage to John Rolfe in 1614 was a diplomatic arrangement intended to stabilize relations between the Confederacy and the English colony. She travelled to England with her husband in 1616, was a sensation in London, met King James I, and died on the Thames in March 1617, before she could sail home. She was approximately 21 years old. Wahunsenacah died the following year in 1618. By all accounts, he was devastated by his daughter's death. His successors took a different approach. In March 1622, the Powhatan Confederacy launched a coordinated surprise attack on English settlements throughout Virginia. 347 English colonists were killed in a single morning, about a third of the entire English population of Virginia. The attack was devastatingly effective and ultimately catastrophic for the Confederacy. The English response was sustained, methodical, and brutal. The empire that Wahunsenacah had spent his life building was gone within a generation of his death. The place where that empire stood is now one of the most densely developed regions in North America. The evidence of it is mostly underground, mostly unexcavated, mostly unknown. I want to tell you about a prophecy, because this is one of the strangest details in the entire history of colonial Virginia, and it never gets the attention it deserves. Multiple early English sources, including John Smith, who heard it from indigenous informants, record that Wahunsenacah was guided in his political decisions by a specific prophecy. The prophecy: a nation would arise from the Chesapeake Bay region that would overthrow Wahunsenacah's confederacy. The Algonquian peoples of coastal Virginia had a sophisticated religious system. Priests called Quiocaros served as interpreters of the spiritual world, performing ceremonies, reading signs, and providing political counsel. Major political decisions were made, in consultation with the Kiokaros. The prophecy of the Chesapeake overthrow was not a rumour. It was an official, religiously sanctioned prediction from the spiritual authorities of the Confederacy, and Wahunsenacah took it seriously. How seriously? Seriously enough that he launched a war of extermination against the Chesapeake tribe, the people living near the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, exactly the geographic area named in the prophecy. He wiped them out, all of them, men, women, children, complete destruction of the tribe. This happened approximately around 1607. The same year the English arrived at Chesapeake Bay. Let me just let that sit for a moment. Wahunsenacah destroys the Chesapeake tribe to prevent the prophecy from being fulfilled. He eliminates everyone who lives in the Chesapeake region, and then, weeks or months later, ships appear from the east, and English colonists begin building a fort on the Chesapeake coast. Was the prophecy about the English? Did Wahunsenacah make that connection? The historical evidence suggests he might have. Some historians believe that Wahunsenacah's initial willingness to manage rather than destroy the English was shaped, at least in part, by this prophecy. If the English were the fulfillment of the prophecy, destroying them might not stop it. It might just delay it, or make it worse. Better to try to incorporate them and neutralize the threat that way. There's a further layer to this that's even stranger. John Smith, in his accounts of exploring the Virginia coast, reported hearing from indigenous informants about people in the interior who wore English clothing and lived in English-style structures, people who had apparently been living somewhere in the Virginia interior for some years before the Jamestown colony was established. These reports have been interpreted by many historians as references to survivors of the Roanoke colony, the 115 people who disappeared from the North Carolina coast in 1590. Some historians believe the Roanoke colonists made their way north and were living with the Chesapeake tribe. If that's true, if the Roanoke colonists were living with the Chesapeake tribe when Wahunsenacah destroyed it, then the massacre he ordered to prevent the Chesapeake prophecy may have also killed the missing colonists of Roanoke, a prophecy, a preemptive massacre, the possible murder of the lost colony, all happening in the same window of time, all connected by the geography of Chesapeake Bay. We can't prove it. The historical evidence is fragmentary, but the convergence of events is remarkable, and the prophecy, the one fact we can document from multiple independent sources, sits at the center of it. A nation from the Chesapeake will destroy your empire. He tried to prevent it. He did everything right, by the logic of the prophecy. It didn't work. Most Americans who know anything about pre-colonial Virginia know about the Powhatan Confederacy. Almost nobody talks about the Monacan. The Monacan nation lived in the Piedmont region of Virginia, the rolling foothills between the flat coastal plain and the dramatic wall of the Blue Ridge Mountains. They were a Siouan-speaking people, linguistically and culturally distinct from the Algonquian-speaking nations of the Tidewater. Critically, they were not part of Wahunsenacah's empire. They were rivals of the Powhatan Confederacy, competing for trade routes, for influence, for territory. English historians didn't find the Monacan particularly interesting. They were interior people. They didn't control the coast, and so they were written about briefly, mentioned occasionally, and largely ignored. This is unfortunate, because the Monacan archaeologically speaking, are one of the most fascinating cultures in Virginia. The Monacan built mounds, earthen burial mounds, constructed over long periods of time, placed at specific locations along the rivers of the Virginia Piedmont. The most famous of these mounds, located in Amherst County on the south bank of the James River, is the one that Thomas Jefferson excavated in 1784. Jefferson's excavation of the Monacan burial mound is considered one of the founding moments of American archaeology. Not because Jefferson was a particularly careful archaeologist. By modern standards, his excavation was destructive and poorly documented. But because of what he did that no one else had done before him, he dug a trench through the mound and looked at the layers. He observed that the mound wasn't a single deposit. It had been built up in multiple stages over a long period of time. Different strata contained different materials. The bones were at different levels. The mound was the product of generations of use, not a single burial event. This was, in 1784, a genuinely novel observation. Jefferson was applying what we would now call stratigraphic reasoning, the principle that deeper layers are older than shallower layers. He was treating the mound as a document to be read, not just a pile of dirt to be emptied. What he found inside was striking, bone on bone, layer after layer, mixed and jumbled and redeposited. He estimated the mound contained the remains of 1,000 people. 1,000 people, buried in one place, over many generations on the bank of the James River. Why here? What was it about this specific bend of this specific river that made it sacred enough to bury your dead here, generation after generation, for perhaps centuries? The Monacan oral tradition, as preserved by the Monacan Indian Nation, a federally recognized tribe that still exists and still lives in Virginia, says the mound was a gathering place for the dead. A place where ancestors remained close to the living. The proximity of the river was not incidental. Water, in Monacan cosmology, was a boundary between worlds. To bury your people at the river's edge was to place them at the threshold between this world and the next. The mound was a library, a temple, a map of the relationship between the living and the dead, all in one pile of earth on a Virginia riverbank, and it's one of many. Archaeological survey of the Virginia Piedmont has documented dozens of earthwork sites, not all as well preserved as the James River mound, but all showing evidence of deliberate construction, deliberate placement, deliberate use over extended periods. They cluster along rivers. They appear at roughly regular intervals. They seem to be marking something, a route, a boundary, a sacred geography that we don't fully understand. Some researchers have suggested these mounds connect to the Hopewell cultural sphere, which we'll talk about when we get to Virginia's copper trade. Others think they're more locally grounded. Nobody fully agrees. What nobody disputes is this: the Monacan were not simple, isolated people. They were participants in networks of trade, ceremony, and cultural exchange that connected Virginia to the Great Lakes, to the Gulf Coast, to the Rocky Mountains. The mounds are proof of that, and most of them haven't been excavated. Most of them are sitting in farm fields and suburban backyards and state parks, quietly holding whatever they hold, waiting. In 1587, 115 English men, women, and children arrived on Roanoke Island, off the coast of what is now North Carolina, just south of the Virginia border, and attempted to establish the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. By 1590, they were gone. Not dead, not destroyed, not massacred, just gone. The Lost Colony of Roanoke is the oldest unsolved mystery in American history. It has been studied for over 400 years. It has generated more theories, more expeditions, more heated academic debate, and more genuine public fascination than almost any other historical puzzle on this continent. And we still don't know what happened. Let me tell you the story properly. The English had tried to plant a colony in this region before. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh, operating under a charter from Queen Elizabeth I to colonize the territory he was calling Virginia, sent an expedition that established a small settlement on Roanoke Island. That first colony failed. The colonists suffered through a brutal winter, ran out of food, and eventually sailed home with Sir Francis Drake. In 1587, Raleigh tried again, this time with real colonists, families, people who intended to stay and build a permanent life. The governor of the colony was a man named John White, an artist, a map maker, an intelligent and capable man who had been on the first Roanoke expedition and knew the territory. Among the colonists was White's daughter, Eleanor Dare. Eleanor was pregnant when she arrived. On August 18th, 1587, roughly 3 weeks after the colonists landed, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. The child was baptized Virginia Dare. She was the first English child born in the Americas. 10 days later, John White sailed back to England. He hadn't wanted to go. The colony needed supplies, food, tools, ammunition, more colonists. Somebody needed to sail back to England and organize a resupply mission. The colonists voted that White should be the one to go, because he had the best connections with Raleigh and the Virginia Company. White didn't want to leave. He had a daughter. He had a granddaughter who was 10 days old. He was leaving his family on an island on the edge of the known world. But he went, because somebody had to. He planned to be back within the year. He was not back within the year. In 1588, the Spanish Armada sailed for England. Every English ship was commandeered for national defense. There were no ships available for resupply missions to Virginia. White managed to get 2 small ships and sail in April 1588, but they were attacked by privateers, damaged and forced back to England. White spent the next 2 years desperately trying to arrange a return voyage. He wrote letters. He lobbied Raleigh. He pleaded with anyone who would listen. In 1590, 3 years after he'd left Virginia, 3 years after he'd left his family on that island, White finally found passage on a ship and sailed back to Roanoke. He arrived on August 18th, 1590. Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. The island was empty, not destroyed, not burned, not the scene of a battle. The houses had been dismantled, carefully taken apart, not collapsed. The palisade had been taken down. The structures had been removed in an orderly way, as if the colonists had planned to move and had taken their buildings with them to reassemble somewhere else. White searched the settlement. He found a few rusted items of no value. He found some books belonging to him that had been left in the sand and damaged by rain. And he found 2 things carved into wood. On a post at the entrance to the settlement, carved in capital letters, Croatoan. On a nearby tree, carved into the bark, CRO. That was all. No other message. No explanation, no indication of what had happened or where everyone had gone. Before White had left in 1587, he'd made an arrangement with the colonists. If you move while I'm gone, carve the name of your destination somewhere visible. If you leave in distress, if something is wrong, if you're in danger, add a cross above the name. There was no cross. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island about 50 miles south, what is now Hatteras Island. It was also the name of the indigenous people who lived there. The Croatoan had been friendly to the English. A man named Manteo from the Croatoan had travelled to England with an earlier expedition and back, and served as a guide and interpreter for the colonists. White took the carved word as a hopeful sign. The colonists had moved to Croatoan Island. They were with the Croatoan people. They were alive. He tried to sail to Croatoan Island. The weather turned, storms. His anchors dragged. His ships were in poor condition. His crew was exhausted and not willing to risk the shoals around Hatteras in bad weather. White was forced to sail away. He returned to England. He would never come back to America. He would never find out what happened to his daughter or to his 3-year-old granddaughter, Virginia Dare. He spent the rest of his life not knowing. 430 years later, we're still in the same position. Theory 1. The colonists went to Croatoan Island and assimilated into the Croatoan people. This is the theory White himself believed. Support: the carved word, the absence of violence, the friendly prior relationship with the Croatoan. Early 17th century reports describe people in the Hatteras region with lighter complexion and grey eyes. The Lumbee Nation in North Carolina has claimed for generations that they are in part descended from Roanoke colonists, a genuinely held tradition within the community. Problem: no definitive archaeological or genetic evidence yet. Theory 2. The colonists split up. Some went to Croatoan Island, others went inland. In the 2000s, the first Colony Foundation found evidence at a site called Site X, about 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island, that included 16th century European artifacts consistent with people living there, not just passing through. This is the best physical evidence yet that at least some colonists went inland. Theory 3. The colonists were killed. Some historians believe they made their way north and were living with the Chesapeake tribe when Wahunsenacah ordered its destruction around 1607. John Smith reported hearing from indigenous informants that Wahunsenacah confirmed ordering the killing of people who had been living with the Chesapeake. People described as wearing European-style clothing and living in European-style structures. If those accounts are accurate, the Roanoke colonists were alive for at least 17 years after their colony was abandoned. They survived. They built a life somewhere in the Virginia interior, and then they were killed, not because they'd failed to survive, but because they got caught in the political violence of Wahunsenacah's empire building. Virginia Dare would have been about 19 years old when that massacre happened. She might have grown up in Virginia. She might have had children. We don't know. We will probably never know. The Lost Colony of Roanoke is not just a historical puzzle. It's a human tragedy. 115 people who trusted that a ship would come back for them, who waited and waited and eventually had to decide, we can't wait any longer. We have to do something. And whatever they decided, whatever they did, wherever they went, they walked off the historical record. And they never came back. The Roanoke colony vanished. The English processed this and tried again. In 1607, 3 ships arrived in the Chesapeake Bay carrying 104 English colonists. They sailed up a river they named the James, and on May 14th, 1607, they began building a settlement, Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in the Americas. Permanent. That word is doing so much heavy lifting. The story of Jamestown, as taught in American schools, is a story of grit and perseverance. The brave colonists overcame tremendous hardship and laid the foundations of American civilization. The House of Burgesses, representative government, the seeds of democracy. All of that is true. But the actual experience of being in Jamestown in the first decade of the colony was considerably more horrifying than the school curriculum version suggests. Let's start with the location. The colonists chose to build on a peninsula jutting into the James River. From a defensive standpoint, this made some sense. The peninsula was easy to defend from land attack. From every other standpoint, it was a terrible choice. The peninsula was swampy. The water supply was brackish and contaminated. The soil was poor. The location was low-lying and prone to flooding. In summer, the combination of standing water, heat, and mosquitoes created ideal conditions for malaria, typhoid, and dysentery. The colonists started dying almost immediately. In the first year, roughly half of the original 104 colonists were dead. Disease, starvation, the occasional attack by Powhatan warriors. The situation was complicated by the social composition of the colonists. A significant number were gentlemen, men of upper-class backgrounds who considered physical labor beneath them, and who had come to Virginia expecting to find gold and get rich quickly, not to dig wells and plant corn. Captain John Smith famously instituted a policy: those who do not work shall not eat. This was less a moral statement than a desperate survival measure. Smith's strong leadership kept Jamestown alive during the period he was there, but in September 1609 he was injured in a gunpowder accident and sailed back to England permanently. Without him, the colony deteriorated rapidly. The winter of 1609 to 1610 is known as the Starving Time. When English ships arrived at Jamestown in May 1610, they found approximately 60 survivors. Out of 500 people who had been in Jamestown 6 months earlier, 440 people dead in one winter. What killed them? Disease was ongoing, but the primary killer was starvation. Wahunsenacah, fed up with the English and their failure to behave like proper subordinate tributaries, had cut off food sales and instructed his warriors to attack any colonist who left the fort to forage. The English were trapped inside their palisade, eating their food stores down to nothing, with no way to get more. They ate horses, then dogs, then rats and mice, then leather, boots and saddles and harnesses boiled until soft enough to chew. They reportedly ate starch from the ruffs of their collars, and then, when there was nothing else left, they ate each other. This was documented in contemporary written accounts. George Percy, who survived the Starving Time, wrote about it. Other survivors wrote about it. One account describes a colonist who killed his pregnant wife, salted her body, and had consumed part of her before being discovered. He was executed. The wife's name was never recorded. For a long time, historians treated these accounts with some skepticism. People writing about extreme situations exaggerate. The truth might be less extreme. In 2012, that changed. Archaeologists excavating at Jamestown found a skeleton in a trash pit. mixed with horse bones and dog bones and the other detritus of people who had been eating things they normally would not eat. It was a young girl, approximately 14 years old. They named her Jane. Jane's skull had been cut open, her brain had been removed. The cuts on her skull and jaw were deliberate and systematic, consistent with what archaeologists call food processing, the same kinds of marks you find on butchered animal bones. She had been butchered. She had been eaten. Jane's bones confirmed in physical, skeletal, undeniable form what the written accounts had said. During the starving time at Jamestown, people ate people. Jamestown is taught as the birthplace of American democracy. The House of Burgesses was established there in 1619, the first representative legislative body in English North America. That is also true. Both things are true at the same time. The place where American representative government was born is also the place where colonists ate a 14-year-old girl to survive a winter. History doesn't clean up after itself. One more Jamestown secret. In 1619, the same year as the House of Burgesses, a Dutch ship arrived at Point Comfort, Virginia, and traded 20 and odd Negroes for supplies. These were the first documented Africans to be held in bondage in English Virginia. The full story of who they were has been partially reconstructed by historians. They were from Angola, captured by Portuguese slave traders and put on a ship bound for Vera Cruz. That ship was attacked by English privateers. Their names in some cases survive in historical records. Some of them eventually obtained their freedom. Some became landowners. The rigid, race-based, hereditary slavery that would come to define Virginia took decades to fully codify. It was built piece by piece through a series of increasingly restrictive laws passed by that same House of Burgesses, but it started at Jamestown in 1619, the same year as the first legislature. Democracy and slavery born together in the same colonial settlement in the same year. That's the true story of Jamestown. I want to tell you about a treasure map, technically 3 treasure maps, written in code, one of which has been cracked, 2 of which have not, and about the $43 million in gold, silver, and jewels that those maps allegedly lead to, buried somewhere in the hills of Bedford County, Virginia, where it has been sitting since approximately 1820. This story sounds like it was invented by someone who had been reading too many adventure novels. It wasn't invented. Or if it was, it's been one of the most successful hoaxes in American history, one that has fooled professional cryptographers, academic historians, and government code breakers for a century and a half. In 1885, a short pamphlet was published in Lynchburg, Virginia, anonymous author. The pamphlet told the following story, allegedly based on documents and conversations with a man named Robert Morris before his death. In January of 1820, a man named Thomas Jefferson Beale arrived at the Washington Hotel in Lynchburg. Tall, dark, handsome, charming, clearly well educated. He stayed through the winter, left in the spring, returned the following January, stayed again, made friends with the hotel's owner, Robert Morris, and then left in the spring of 1822. Before leaving, Beale gave Morris a locked iron box. "Hold on to this for me. I'll be back in 10 years to collect it. If I'm not back in 10 years, a letter will be sent to you from a friend of mine with the key to unlock and decode the contents." Beale left. He never came back. The letter with the key never came. Morris waited 10 years, then 20. He tried to contact Beale, no trace of him anywhere. Thomas Jefferson Beale had simply vanished. Morris finally opened the box. Inside were 3 sheets of paper, each covered in numbers, long strings of numbers grouped irregularly with no obvious pattern, and a separate letter in plain English from Beale, explaining what the numbered papers contained. According to Beale's letter, he had led a group of 30 men on a hunting and trapping expedition into the American West in 1817. Somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, the group had discovered an extraordinary gold deposit. They spent 2 seasons mining it. Then they brought the accumulated treasure east in wagons and buried it in a vault in Bedford County, Virginia. The vault contained 2,921 pounds of gold, 5,100 pounds of silver, and jewels worth approximately $13,000 in 1820 dollars. In modern value, approximately $43 to $65 million, depending on how you calculate it. Sitting in a vault in the hills of Bedford County, Virginia, locked behind 2 undeciphered codes, Beale's letter explained the 3 coded papers. Paper 1 described the exact location of the vault. Paper 2 described the contents in specific detail. Paper 3 listed the names and addresses of the 30 men who should share in the treasure. Morris spent years trying to decode the papers. He couldn't. Before he died, he gave them to the anonymous pamphlet author, who spent 20 more years on them, and he cracked one. Paper 2, the one describing the contents, turned out to use the Declaration of Independence as its key. Each number in the cipher corresponds to a word in the Declaration of Independence. The first letter of that word is the letter of the message. Using this key, Paper 2 decodes to a detailed, internally consistent description of the treasure. The exact weights of gold and silver, the types of jewels, the fact that it's buried in a vault lined with stone, approximately 6 feet underground. Papers and 3 have never been decoded. In the 140 years since the pamphlet was published, some of the most sophisticated code breakers in the world have tried. During World War II, government cryptanalysts worked on them unofficially. Professional mathematicians have applied computational methods. The internet age has brought thousands of amateur enthusiasts. Nobody has cracked papers 1 and 3. Here are the honest possibilities. Possibility 1, it's a hoax. The pamphlet author invented the whole thing for financial gain. Paper 2 was designed to be crackable, using the Declaration as a key, specifically to make the hoax seem credible. Papers 1 and 3 are uncrackable because there's nothing to find. This is the position of most academic historians. Possibility 2, the treasure is real, the ciphers are real, but papers 1 and 3 use a key that has been lost. Beale sent the key to the pamphlet author's predecessor. That letter never arrived. Without the key, the ciphers may be mathematically uncrackable, no matter how sophisticated the approach. Possibility 3. Someone has cracked them, found the treasure, and said nothing. What we know for certain, Bedford County, Virginia, has been searched more thoroughly by more determined treasure hunters than almost any comparable area in America. There are 19th century excavations and mine shafts scattered throughout the county that predate any known mining activity, suggesting people have been looking for something there long before the pamphlet was published. What we know for certain, nobody has proven it's a hoax. $43 million, Bedford County, Virginia. 2 unciphered pages still there. Sleep well. In Rockbridge County, Virginia, named for it, there is a geological formation that has been considered one of the wonders of North America for as long as anyone has been recording such things. Natural Bridge is a massive natural limestone arch, carved by Cedar Creek over the last 10 to 20 million years, as the stream slowly cut through the rock above it. The arch stands 215 feet high, taller than Niagara Falls. It's 90 feet wide. At its narrowest point, it's 50 feet thick. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary thing. But here's what I want to focus on, not the geology, the human history, because Natural Bridge has one of the longest continuous histories of human significance of any site in North America. And that history is strange in a specific way that doesn't get talked about enough. The Monacan nation called it the Bridge of God. They considered it one of the most sacred places in their world. Multiple indigenous nations across multiple centuries, speaking completely different languages, coming from completely different cultural backgrounds, all independently arrived at the same conclusion about Natural Bridge. This is a sacred place. This is not a place you pass through casually. This is a place that requires ceremony, respect, and acknowledgement. That kind of convergent, sacred designation, completely independent cultures arriving at the same spiritual assessment of the same place, is not coincidental. It's data. Something about Natural Bridge produces a consistent human response across cultural boundaries. The stories associated with Natural Bridge describe it as a place of vision-seeking, a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors was thin, a place where communication with spiritual powers was possible. That specificity, the consistent description of it as a threshold place, a between worlds place, suggests something more than just aesthetics. Here's a scientific possibility worth considering. Natural Bridge sits at the intersection of several geological formations. Cedar Creek has carved through multiple layers of limestone, creating complex underground drainage patterns. There are caves in the area. The geology is complex, the same kind of complex geology associated in other contexts with the natural production of infrasound. Infrasound is sound below the threshold of human hearing, below 20 hertz. Humans can't hear it, but they can feel it. Low-frequency infrasound has been associated in experimental settings with feelings of unease, awe, the sensation of a presence, and what people describe as spiritual or supernatural experiences. Certain geological settings naturally generate infrasound, wind moving through rock formations, underground water movement, specific combinations of cave systems and surface topology. Nobody has formally measured infrasound levels at Natural Bridge, but the consistent human experience across thousands of years. This place is different. This place is a threshold. This place produces experiences that feel qualitatively different from ordinary experience. That's not nothing. Thomas Jefferson, who purchased Natural Bridge in 1774 and owned it until his death, described the experience of looking down from the top of the arch as inducing what he called a violent headache, and causing him to fall onto his hands and knees and crawl to the edge to look down. But he also wrote that the view from below inspired a rapture that is really indescribable. Jefferson was not a man given to spiritual or supernatural language. He was a rationalist, a materialist, A natural bridge made him crawl on his hands and knees. George Washington surveyed the bridge as a young man. He reportedly carved his initials G.W. into the rock wall of the gorge 17 feet up the cliff face. They're still there today. Archaeological investigation of the area has confirmed human presence stretching back at least 8,000 years. 8 millennia of people coming to this arch, standing beneath it, looking up, and feeling whatever they felt. Natural Bridge is a national monument now. 500,000 visitors a year, parking lot, gift shop, guided tours. Most of them take photos and move on. Very few of them know they're standing on one of the most continuously sacred sites in North American history. 8,000 years of people coming here, all of them feeling something. Here is a fact about pre-Columbian North America that should be far more famous than it is. 2,000 years ago, there was a trade network operating on this continent that connected the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Goods moved along this network over distances of hundreds and thousands of miles. The network was organized, sustained, and sophisticated enough to regularly transport heavy and valuable objects across an entire continent. This network is called the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. It's named for a series of archaeological sites in Ohio where its physical evidence was first extensively documented, and Virginia was part of it. The key commodity Virginia contributed was copper. Copper, in pre-Columbian North America, occupied a position in the material and spiritual economy somewhat analogous to gold in the ancient Mediterranean world. It was a prestige metal. It was rare enough to be valuable, malleable enough to be worked into beautiful objects, and sufficiently unusual in appearance, especially when newly polished, to carry a visual power that other materials lacked. Copper objects were buried with the dead as grave goods, indicating they were considered appropriate accompaniments to the afterlife. They were worn as markers of status. They were presented as gifts in diplomatic contexts. They were used in ceremony. And Virginia had copper deposits. The Blue Ridge Mountains and adjacent Piedmont areas contain significant copper mineralization, particularly in the zone around the modern Virginia-North Carolina border. The Monacan, whose territory included much of the Virginia, Piedmont and foothills, were significant producers and traders of copper. When John Smith and other English explorers asked about copper, and they asked constantly, because the English were obsessed with precious metals, they were consistently pointed toward the Monacan territory in the west. But here's the really striking part. Virginia copper, identified by its specific chemical signature, its ratio of trace elements that can be matched to particular geological deposits, has been found in archaeological sites very far from Virginia. Hopewell burial mounds in Ohio, dating to between roughly 100 BCE and 500 CE, contain copper objects that have been chemically traced back to the southern Appalachian region, the same zone as Virginia's deposits. This is not a small amount of copper moving by chance through a few trading relationships. The Hopewell sites in Ohio contain copper in enormous quantities. The logistics of moving that material, or the organization, the social relationships, the sustained commitment over centuries, imply a network of genuine sophistication. And what was coming back to Virginia in exchange? Obsidian from Yellowstone, a volcanic glass that, in its native form, doesn't exist anywhere east of the Rocky Mountains. yet it has been found in Hopewell-affiliated sites throughout the eastern United States, mica from the Carolinas, cut into spectacular animal and human forms, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, shark teeth, alligator teeth, objects from ecosystems that are many hundreds of miles from any Hopewell heartland site. This continent 2,000 years ago was not a collection of isolated, primitive tribes living in ignorance of each other. It was a world with trade networks that spanned a continent, a world where a shell from the Gulf Coast could end up in a burial mound in Ohio, where Virginia copper could end up near Yellowstone, where obsidian from the Rocky Mountains could be worked into ceremonial objects in Virginia. This is not taught in most American schools. The mythology of the empty wilderness, the primitive native, these images are not just inaccurate. They are the opposite of accurate. The evidence has been in the museum cases for 100 years. The copper, with its chemical signatures, the obsidian far from its source, the shells from the wrong ocean. Virginia's ancient people were not isolated. They were connected to a continent. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology had what they called the Clovis First Consensus. The first humans to enter the Americas crossed from Siberia to Alaska via the Bering Land Bridge approximately 13,000 years ago. They moved south through a gap that opened between ice sheets as the glaciers retreated. They spread rapidly across North and South America. Their distinctive stone tool technology, the Clovis point, appeared in the archaeological record approximately 13,000 years ago. Below the Clovis layer, there were no stone tools, no evidence of human presence. Therefore, Clovis was first. No humans in the Americas before 13,000 years ago. This was the consensus. It was widely accepted. Researchers who challenged it faced significant professional pushback. And then came Cactus Hill. Cactus Hill is an archaeological site in Sussex County, southeastern Virginia. It sits on a sandy bluff above the Nottoway River, the kind of well-drained, elevated site that ancient people consistently chose for camps because it was defensible, dry, and had good sight lines. The site was excavated in the mid-1990s by archaeologists from the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. What they found was unexpected. There were Clovis tools in the site. That was expected. Virginia has Clovis sites. But below the Clovis layer, in older, deeper sediments, clearly separated from the Clovis material by a sterile layer of undisturbed sand, there were stone tools. Not Clovis tools, smaller, differently shaped, representing a different technological tradition, associated with wood charcoal that could be radiocarbon dated. The dates came back, approximately 15,000 to 17,000 years before present, 2,000 to 4,000 years older than Clovis. If these dates were correct, and they have been confirmed by subsequent analysis using multiple independent methods, then people were in Virginia thousands of years before the Clovis culture existed. The Clovis first model was wrong, or at minimum, dramatically incomplete. The reaction from the archaeological establishment was, predictably, skeptical. Contamination was suggested. Maybe the dating was wrong. Maybe the association between the tools and the charcoal wasn't as clean as the excavators believed. Additional excavations at Cactus Hill, combined with comparative analysis with other pre-Clovis sites being documented around the same time, Monte Verde in Chile, Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, gradually shifted the consensus. Cactus Hill is now accepted by most archaeologists as a genuine pre-Clovis site. The Clovis first model has been abandoned. But here's the mystery that Cactus Hill opened up rather than closed. Where did the pre-Clovis people come from? The Bering Land Bridge theory still works for some of the early arrivals. An earlier Bering crossing, perhaps 18,000 or 20,000 years ago, would account for some of the pre-Clovis evidence. A coastal migration route. People moving south along the Pacific coast in boats, following the kelp forest ecosystem, has gained significant support in recent years. And then there's the theory that most archaeologists don't like, but that a small number of serious researchers keep returning to: the Atlantic hypothesis. The Solutrean culture of Ice Age Europe, the people who lived in France and Spain roughly 20,000 years ago, made sophisticated tools that have striking similarities to pre-Clovis tools found in eastern North America, including Cactus Hill. The Solutrean hypothesis proposes that some of these Ice Age Europeans crossed the Atlantic by following the ice edge and the rich marine resources it supported, the same ecological niche the Inuit would exploit thousands of years later. This hypothesis is rejected by most archaeologists. The genetic evidence doesn't support significant pre-Columbian European input into Native American populations. The tool similarities might be convergent evolution, the same technological problems producing similar solutions independently. But Cactus Hill in Sussex County, Virginia, is part of why the question is still being asked. The site sits by the Nottoway River, a quiet, wooded county in southeastern Virginia, and the tools in its soil are older than American prehistory was supposed to allow. Deep in the mountains of southwestern Virginia, in the counties of Lee, Scott, and Wise, and into the neighboring mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina, there was a population of people who consistently confused, alarmed, and fascinated outside observers for most of American history. They were called the Melungeons. The origin of the name is itself disputed. Some researchers trace it to a Portuguese word, some to an African French word, some to a Turkish word. Some argue the name's origins are as mysterious as the people themselves. What everyone who encountered the Melungeons agreed on: they were hard to classify. They were physically dark complexioned, as observers consistently described them, but they weren't African in appearance, or at least not in the way that the rigid racial categories of 19th century America defined African. They weren't clearly indigenous, they weren't clearly European, they were something that didn't fit the available boxes. They spoke English. Old English, Elizabethan inflected English with archaisms that suggested their community had been isolated from mainstream American linguistic development for a long time. They had English surnames: Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, Bunch, names that pointed toward English or Scots-Irish ancestry. They were Christians, but observers noted elements in their practice that didn't fit standard Protestant tradition, and when asked where they came from, they gave various answers: Portuguese, Turkish, Moorish. We've always been here. We came from across the water a long time ago. The 19th century American state could not fit them into its racial categories. Census takers listed them as free persons of color. the catch-all designation for anyone who wasn't clearly white or clearly enslaved. This designation came with legal consequences, increasing restrictions on voting, on education, on where they could live, on what they could own. The Melungeons, in response, did what people do when a society tries to categorize and restrict them. They retreated to the mountains where the categories couldn't easily follow. In the 21st century, DNA analysis has provided partial answers and created new questions. The genetic studies found that Melungeon ancestry is primarily a mixture of sub-Saharan African and northern/Western European. This suggests a specific historical scenario. In the early colonial period, the mid-17th century, Virginia's racial categories were still being constructed. Free black Virginians had legal rights, they owned property. But through the 1650s, 1660s, and 1670s, Virginia's legislature systematically constructed race-based slavery. Laws were passed defining the status of children of enslaved mothers. Laws restricted the rights of free black Virginians. The racial middle ground was being eliminated. Some free black Virginians and their white partners, couples in relationships that were increasingly criminalized by Virginia law, responded by moving into the mountains, into the places where the law's reach was weakest and racial categories were hardest to enforce. They built communities there, they survived, they persisted, and over generations their descendants became the Melungeons. This is the DNA story. It's probably right, at least as a general framework. But here's what the DNA story doesn't fully explain: the oral traditions. Melungeon family traditions, passed down through generations, consistently reference ancestors who came from farther away: Portuguese sailors, Turkish or Moorish adventurers, people from across the water. These stories have the structure and emotional weight of genuine origin traditions, not invented cover stories, but something that carried real meaning within the community. Why would families descended from colonial Virginia farm workers consistently describe themselves as Portuguese? One possibility: protective mythology. In a society where racial identity determined legal status, claiming Portuguese ancestry, claiming to be something other than African, was a legal argument as much as a historical claim. Another possibility: the oral traditions contain genuine historical memories that the DNA studies, which are necessarily incomplete and aggregated, don't capture. Virginia in the 17th century was a genuine crossroads. The mixing that produced the Melungeons might have been more complex, more global than the broad strokes DNA picture suggests. The full story of the Melungeons is still being written. What's clear is this: the Melungeons are a Virginia story. A story about what happens when a society tries to organize people into clean categories and people refuse to fit. A story about survival, isolation, and the mountains as a refuge from a society that wanted to tell you who you were. And a story whose origins remain, at least in part, genuinely mysterious. The Shenandoah Valley is one of the most beautiful landscapes in eastern North America. Anyone who has driven through it in October, when the hardwoods are turning and the Blue Ridge is lit up like it's on fire, knows exactly what I mean. It is also one of the most contested pieces of ground in American history. The valley runs roughly northeast to southwest between the Blue Ridge on the east and the Allegheny Mountains on the west. It's approximately 200 miles long and varies between 15 and 25 miles wide. The floor of the valley is fertile limestone-based soil, productive agricultural land by any standard. That fertility is why the valley has been fought over, occupied, and contested for 12,000 years. The first humans moved into the Shenandoah Valley as the glaciers retreated, following the megafauna herds northward as the climate warmed. Archaeological sites in the valley's floor, in riverbanks and farm fields and road cuts, have produced Paleo-Indian artifacts dating to the earliest period of human presence in Virginia. Over the following millennia, the valley was home to a succession of cultures, each leaving its trace in the soil. Archaic camps along the streams, woodland-period villages on the terraces above the floodplain, late prehistoric community growing corn in the fertile bottomland. The valley was also always a highway, a route through which nations from the north and south moved on seasonal rounds and trading expeditions, a corridor for settlers moving southwest toward the Carolina backcountry in the 18th century, a route for armies during the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and, most dramatically, the Civil War. The Shenandoah Valley was strategically crucial during the Civil War, the breadbasket of the Confederacy, a natural corridor for movement into the north. In the summer and fall of 1864, Union General Philip Sheridan received a specific order from Ulysses Grant regarding the valley: destroy it, burn the crops, destroy the barns, drive off, or kill the livestock, make the valley useless as a food source and logistics base. Grant reportedly said the destruction should be so complete that a crow flying over the valley would have to carry its own provisions. The valley burned, and in the burning, and in the decades of poverty and disruption that followed, historical records were lost. Farm records, deeds, family Bibles, personal letters, documents that might have shed light on the valley's pre-colonial and early colonial history. The archaeological record of the Shenandoah Valley reflects these layers of destruction and neglect. There are hundreds of documented archaeological sites in the valley. Most have been disturbed by the very agriculture that made the valley valuable, by development, by war. Systematic archaeological survey of the entire valley has never been completed. What has been excavated confirms the deep timeline, 12,000 years of continuous human presence. But confirmed and understood are different things. The valley holds what 12,000 years always holds: more than we know, more than we've found, more than we've asked the right questions about yet. The Shenandoah means daughter of the stars in Lenape, or bright daughter of the skies. Nobody is completely sure of the translation, which is itself a small mystery about a name that has been spoken in this landscape for longer than English has existed. Daughter of the stars. In the valley where armies burned the earth and 12,000 years of human life lie underneath the farms. April 2nd, 1865. Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, Sunday morning. Church services interrupted. Confederate President Jefferson Davis has received a telegram from General Robert E. Lee. Petersburg has fallen. The Union Army has broken through. Richmond must be evacuated tonight. The Confederate government has a few hours to decide what to leave and what to take. What they took, among other things, was money. The Confederate Treasury at the time of evacuation held gold and silver coin, gold bullion, silver ingots from the Richmond banks, and some foreign currency. Estimates of the total vary, but most historians place it somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million in 1865 dollars, which translates to between $8 million and $20 million in modern value. The treasury was loaded onto a train. Along with the Confederate government, the Confederate archives, and whatever of value could be quickly moved, this train left Richmond on the night of April 2nd, 1865. What happened to that money over the following 3 weeks is one of the great unresolved questions of Civil War history. The Treasury train moved south through Virginia into the Carolinas toward Georgia. Davis and his cabinet had no clear plan. They were improvising as the Confederacy collapsed around them. Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th. Johnston surrendered to Sherman in North Carolina on April 26th. Along the route, money was distributed. Sailors who had served in the Confederate Navy were paid a portion of what they were owed. Military units received some funds. Confederate officials were given money for expenses. On April the 26th, what remained of the Confederate Treasury was turned over to Union authorities in Washington, Georgia. Here's the problem. The amount received by Union authorities doesn't match the amount that left Richmond. Historians have done the math multiple times from multiple directions, using contemporary documents from both Confederate and Union sources. There's a gap, a significant gap. Some of the gap is explained by the distributions made along the route. Some of it is explained by theft, both by Confederate soldiers who helped themselves to what they saw as a lost cause's last assets, and by Union soldiers who intercepted portions of the treasury. Some of it has never been accounted for. The folklore of this missing Confederate gold is extensive. Stories have circulated since the 1860s about caches buried before Union cavalry caught up. Bags of coin dropped into rivers. Church deacons burying gold under their floors on the night the government fled south. Virginia, as the first leg of the Treasury's journey, is where the most significant distributions and the most opportunity for concealment existed. The area around Danville in southern Virginia, where Davis briefly established a government in exile, has been the subject of treasure hunting activity since shortly after the war. Local traditions describe buried gold in specific locations. Some of these traditions are almost certainly legend, but some of the accounts come from specific, identified individuals who were present on the Treasury train or who received portions of the funds. Their accounts sometimes reference specific transactions, specific places, specific amounts that can be partially cross-referenced with other historical records. The total amount of Confederate gold genuinely unaccounted for is unknown. It might be nothing. It might all have been distributed in ways simply not well documented in the chaos of a collapsing government. It might be substantial. What is certain is that the Confederate Treasury left Richmond with more money than arrived in Georgia, and that Virginia is where the difference disappeared. The Blue Ridge Mountains run the length of western Virginia, forming the eastern rampart of the Appalachian chain. These are old mountains, among the oldest on Earth. The rocks that form the Blue Ridge are in some places over 1 billion years old, Precambrian basement rocks that were already ancient when the dinosaurs first appeared. The mountains themselves are the remnants of a range that was once as dramatic and high as the modern Himalayas, worn down over hundreds of millions of years of erosion into the gentle, rounded ridges that exist today. Old mountains are different from young mountains. They have a different feel, a different weight. The Rockies are dramatic and sharp-edged. The Blue Ridge is deep and rounded and layered, the visual effect of enormous time. The indigenous peoples of Virginia understood this. Multiple nations had traditions that specifically acknowledged the Blue Ridge as a different kind of place, not just mountains, but a threshold, the western boundary of the coastal world, the beginning of something else. The Monacan, whose traditional territory extended through the Piedmont foothills up to and into the Blue Ridge, had a cosmological geography that treated the mountain range as a significant spiritual boundary. To the east was the world of the living, the tidewater, the rivers, the coastal plain. To the west was something older, something less known. English settlers moving into the Shenandoah Valley and the Blue Ridge in the 18th century consistently described an experience of the mountains that went beyond ordinary geographic description. Journal entries, letters, sermons, these sources consistently include language about the mountains that carries a weight of strangeness. Certain places where animals behaved oddly, certain hollows that produced sensations of unease without apparent cause, certain caves that felt, as multiple observers put it in different ways, like they led somewhere they didn't want to go. But there's a specific pattern in these accounts that's harder to dismiss as simple unfamiliarity. The places described as uncanny, the places where livestock refused to go, where the feeling of presence was strongest, where experienced hunters got lost, despite knowing the terrain. These places consistently have specific geological characteristics. They're at the intersections of rock types, at the junctions of geological formations, at the places where the underlying rock structure changes, and they're often associated with water, springs, seeps, the heads of streams, places where water emerges from the rock. Researchers studying sacred site traditions across multiple cultures have noted that sites considered sacred or uncanny tend to cluster in geologically distinctive locations, particularly locations associated with fault lines, unusual mineralization, complex underground water systems, and the geological conditions that produce natural infrasound. Virginia's Blue Ridge is a geologically complex place. The range is not a simple block of rock, it's a series of thrust faults, ancient ocean sediments that have been folded and metamorphosed, igneous intrusions from ancient volcanic events, all pressed together and stacked and tilted over billions of years of geological history. The acoustic properties of that landscape, the way sound moves through it, the way underground water creates pressure, differentials, the way wind interacts with specific rock formations, these are not well studied. But the consistent human response across cultures and across centuries to certain specific places in the Blue Ridge, that's data. 800 years of Monacan oral tradition saying this hollow is not ordinary, this spring is a door, this ridge is where you go when you need to hear something. And then 200 years of European settlers saying, I don't know why, but this place feels wrong. I don't know why, but the cattle won't go in there. I don't know why, but I had to leave. That convergence is not nothing. We don't know what it means. But in the old mountains, where the rocks are 1 billion years old and the valleys are carved deep, and the water comes up from places you can't see, something is present. Whatever it is, people have been noticing it for a very long time. We've covered a lot of ground tonight. 15,000 years of human occupation, vanished colonies, encrypted treasure, sacred mountains, ancient trade networks, bones in mounds and bones in trash pits, a prophecy that might have doomed 2 nations, stone tools that rewrote the textbook on American prehistory, mountain people that no one could classify, a valley burned to ash and rebuilt on 12,000 years of forgotten lives. But I want to end with something I think is Virginia's deepest mystery. Deeper than the Beale Ciphers, deeper than Roanoke. And that's this. Virginia is where America's origin mythology was invented. The stories Americans tell about themselves, the foundational myths, the images that anchor national identity, most of them trace back to Virginia, John Smith and Pocahontas, the brave, resourceful settler and the Indian princess who saves him. One of the most famous stories in American history. It's been a children's movie. It's been painted on murals, and as we discuss tonight, it's almost certainly not what it appears to be. It was a ritual of political adoption. Pocahontas wasn't saving Smith. Her father was incorporating him into his empire. But the myth persisted. The myth of the indigenous princess who blessed the colonial project with her sacrifice. It made colonization feel like something other than conquest. George Washington, the father of the country, the indispensable man who won the Revolution and then voluntarily gave up power, an act so unusual in the context of history that it genuinely shocked the world. Washington was a Virginia planter. He grew up in Stafford County. He surveyed the western frontier as a young man, standing on Monacan Mounds, measuring the land that was being taken from the people who had lived on it for thousands of years. He enslaved over 300 people. The myth of Washington, the civic saint, the Republican hero, the man above ambition, was built on and partly to cover the complexity of the actual Washington, Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, words that have resonated through centuries of human struggle for dignity and rights, written by a man who enslaved more than 600 human beings over the course of his lifetime. A man who fathered children with an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings, whom he legally owned, who could not consent to the relationship, who was never freed during his lifetime. This contradiction, not a small inconsistency but the central defining paradox of American history, is a Virginia story. The equality and the slavery, the democracy and the terror, the founding ideals and the foundational crime, all of it, Virginia. Virginia gave America its mythology, because Virginia was where the English colonial project first took hold. The first dramatic confrontations between European ambition and the complex world that already existed here. The first generation of leaders who would define what America claimed to be. Every culture tells stories about its origins that simplify the complexity, that sand off the rough edges, that make the past easier to live with. This is not unique to America, but the specific shape of America's mythology, the specific things it chooses to include and exclude, the specific heroes it venerates and the specific crimes it quietly sets aside. That shape was determined in Virginia. At Jamestown, where people starved and ate each other and established the first legislature and received the first enslaved Africans all in the same decade. At the Monacan Mounds, which Jefferson excavated and documented with scientific precision, and then mostly forgot about, because acknowledging them complicated the narrative of empty wilderness. In the Shenandoah Valley, where 12,000 years of human presence was ploughed under and built over and burned and forgotten, while the myth of the Virgin Land took hold. Virginia is not just where American history began, it's where the stories about American history were first told. And the gap between those stories and the actual history, 15,000 years of it mostly underground, some of it uncracked, all of it waiting. That gap is the deepest mystery Virginia has. All right, that is Virginia. From Cactus Hill, where stone tools 17,000 years old sit in the soil of Sussex County and quietly make everyone rethink American prehistory, to the carved word Croatoan on a post in a deserted settlement, and the 115 people who walked off the historical record and never came back. From the starving winter at Jamestown, where a 14-year-old girl named Jane was butchered and eaten by desperate colonists who also, in the same decade, established the first representative legislature in North America, to the Beale Ciphers in Lynchburg, with $43 million in gold allegedly buried in Bedford County, and 2 undeciphered pages standing between you and it. From the Monacan Mounds on the James River, where 1,000 people across 1,000 years were buried at the threshold between the living world and the dead one, to Natural Bridge in Rockbridge County, where 8,000 years of humans stood under a 215-foot arch and felt something that none of them, across all those languages and cultures and centuries, could quite put into words. From Wahunsenacah's empire built over decades and destroyed in a century, still mostly underground and unexcavated, to the Blue Ridge, with its billion-year-old rocks and its hollows that have been making people and animals uneasy for as long as anyone has been keeping track. From the Melungeons in the mountains, who survived by retreating from a society that couldn't classify them, to the Confederate gold that left Richmond in April 1865 and didn't all arrive in Georgia. From the Shenandoah Valley, burned to ash in 1864 and rebuilt on 12,000 years of forgotten human life, to the continental copper trade network that connected Virginia to Yellowstone and the Gulf of Mexico 2,000 years ago. Virginia is 15,000 years deep, and we have barely scratched the surface. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This is the stuff they don't teach in school. This is the history that lives in the soil and the mountains and the archives and the encrypted pamphlets that nobody has been able to crack for 140 years. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. We do this every week. New ancient mysteries, new forbidden history, new reasons to stay up later than you should. Hit the like button if Virginia surprised you tonight. Drop a comment. I want to know which mystery got you: the Beale Ciphers, the Lost Colony, the pre-Clovis tools at Cactus Hill, the Melungeons. I'm Adam Stone. Sleep well. Dream of Bedford County. And we'll see you next time. Here is an event that should be taught in every American history class and mostly isn't. In 1676, Virginia tore itself apart. Bacon's Rebellion is usually described, when it's described at all, as a conflict between colonial farmers and the Virginia colonial government, an early example of democratic unrest against aristocratic authority, a forerunner of the American Revolution. That description is accurate as far as it goes, but it leaves out the parts that are most historically significant and most disturbing. Let's back up to understand what was happening in Virginia in the 1670s. By this point, Virginia had been a colony for almost 70 years. The original relationship between the English and the Powhatan Confederacy, the managed dependency of the Wahunsenacah era, was long gone. The Confederacy had been broken. The coastal tribes had been pushed back. English settlement was spreading rapidly westward into the Piedmont, into territories that were still contested, still occupied by indigenous nations that had not been defeated. This created constant friction on the frontier, small raids, counter-raids, cycles of violence that the colonial government in Jamestown struggled to manage. The colonial government's approach was essentially contain the conflict, maintain official boundaries, don't let the frontier wars escalate into something that would be economically catastrophic for the tobacco economy. This approach was deeply unpopular with frontier settlers who felt exposed and unprotected. Enter Nathaniel Bacon. Bacon was a young English gentleman recently arrived in Virginia with land on the frontier and an outsized sense of his own importance. He was charismatic, ambitious, and genuinely furious about what he saw as the colonial government's failure to protect frontier settlers. In 1676, Bacon organized a militia and began attacking indigenous peoples along the Virginia frontier. Not hostile indigenous peoples specifically, not the tribes that had actually been raiding English settlements, any indigenous peoples he could find. Bacon's approach to the frontier conflict was simple. All Indians are the enemy. Kill them all. Take their land. The colonial governor, William Berkeley, tried to stop him. Bacon responded by declaring Berkeley a traitor, marching his army to Jamestown and burning the capital to the ground. Yes, Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in America, was burned down in 1676 by English colonists rebelling against their own government. Bacon's rebellion is often framed as a proto-democratic uprising, and there is something to that. Bacon's forces included not just frontier farmers, but also indentured servants, former servants, and enslaved people, a multiracial coalition of the economically dispossessed, united by grievance against the planter elite. This alarmed Virginia's ruling class enormously. The sight of poor white farmers and black enslaved people fighting side by side against the established order suggested a coalition that could be genuinely revolutionary. Many historians believe Bacon's rebellion is one of the key reasons Virginia's ruling class subsequently accelerated the construction of race-based slavery, specifically because the rebellion showed how dangerous cross-racial class solidarity could be. Racial hierarchy in this reading was partly a political tool designed to prevent poor white Virginians from making common cause with black Virginians again. Bacon died suddenly in October 1676, probably of dysentery, though poison has been suggested, and his rebellion collapsed. Berkeley returned to power, hanged a number of the rebel leaders, and attempted to restore order, but not before Bacon had committed one of the most significant acts of destruction in Virginia's indigenous history, the Occoneechee. At the junction of the Dan and Haw rivers, on an island near the modern Virginia-North Carolina border, the Occoneechee people had built the most important trading hub in the Virginia interior. The Occoneechee were not a large nation, they were not a military power, but they were the Amazon of the pre-colonial Virginia interior. Every major trade route in the region passed through their island. Goods flowed through the Occoneechee, deerskins, furs, copper, European tools, wampum, in quantities that made them extraordinarily wealthy and politically influential despite their small numbers. They had survived the colonial period by making themselves indispensable to everyone. They traded with the English. They traded with rival indigenous nations. They maintained enough neutrality to stay out of most conflicts. It almost worked. In 1676, Bacon arrived at Occoneechee Island claiming to be fighting hostile Indians. The Occoneechee, trying to stay neutral, allowed Bacon's forces to camp on their island. Bacon attacked them anyway. In a single assault, he destroyed the Occoneechee town, killed a significant portion of their population, and burned their stored goods. The most important trading hub in the Virginia interior was destroyed in a few hours. The trade networks the Occoneechee had maintained, networks that had connected the Virginia interior to the Atlantic coast for generations, collapsed. Tribes that had relied on the Occoneechee for goods and mediation were suddenly without their central hub. The effects rippled outward for decades. Occoneechee State Park sits near the original site today. Most visitors have no idea what happened there. The island itself was largely inundated by the construction of Kerr Reservoir in the 1950s. Another layer of erasure, another chapter of Virginia's indigenous history, underwater. John Smith, yes, that John Smith, Pocahontas's John Smith, created one of the most detailed and accurate maps of the Virginia region ever made in the early colonial period. The 1612 Smith map is a genuinely remarkable document for a man who had limited surveying tools, limited time, and was operating in an actively hostile political environment where indigenous nations were carefully controlling what information they shared with him. It's astonishingly accurate. The coastline is right. The river systems are recognizable. The major geographic features are in roughly the right places. But here's what's interesting about the Smith map. There are places on it where Smith was clearly working from second-hand information. Places he hadn't been, places that were, as far as the English were concerned, beyond the known frontier. And in those places, Smith's map shows something unusual. Small symbols, marks that indicate the presence of mines. The English were obsessed with precious metals. One of the primary commercial justifications for the Virginia Company was the possibility of finding gold and silver. Spain had found mountains of silver in South America. Surely Virginia had something similar. Smith's map includes, in the interior of Virginia, indications of mineral deposits that he had learned about from indigenous informants. Those informants were telling him the truth. Virginia does have mineral wealth, copper, iron, lead, and in some areas, small amounts of gold. There are documented gold mines in Virginia from the colonial period. The gold is not in the quantities that the Virginia Company had fantasized about. No mountains of silver, no El Dorado, but it exists. But the specific location of the richer deposits, the ones the Monacan and other interior nations controlled and traded, was carefully guarded information. Think about why. The Powhatan Confederacy had a vested interest in not letting the English find the sources of the copper trade. Once the English found the copper deposits directly, they wouldn't need to trade for copper anymore. The economic leverage the Confederacy held over the English, the ability to supply or withhold essential goods, would evaporate. So the geography of Virginia's interior mineral wealth was managed information, controlled, selectively revealed. Smith eventually learned some of it. He put it on his map in the form of those small marks. But the full picture, where the copper came from, where the trading paths ran, what was really in those mountains, that knowledge belonged to the people who lived there. And when those people were displaced, killed, or forced out over the following century, the knowledge went with them. Some of it survived in oral tradition. Some of it has been reconstructed by archaeologists and geologists using modern survey methods. But some of it, the specific locations of specific deposits, the routes of specific trading paths, the places that specific nations considered sacred enough to guard carefully, that knowledge is gone, lost with the people who held it. There is a geographic knowledge of Virginia, an indigenous cartography of the landscape built over thousands of years that we will never fully recover. Smith's map, with its small marks for mines in the unmapped interior, is a window into that lost knowledge, a window that looks out onto a landscape we can no longer see. Throughout the mountains of western Virginia, and more broadly across the Appalachians, there are stone structures that no one has satisfactorily explained. Stone walls, stone chambers, stone alignments. These are not Native American structures in any tradition archaeologists have definitively identified. They're not colonial structures, they don't match colonial building techniques or purposes. They're not natural geological formations. They're built, deliberately built, by someone. Some of the more dramatic examples are stone chambers, small, roughly rectangular or oval enclosures made of stacked stone, with carefully placed capstones forming a roof. They're typically low. You'd have to crouch or crawl to enter them. They're dark inside. Some are oriented toward the sunrise or sunset on specific dates. They look, to anyone familiar with European archaeology, like megalithic structures. They look like the stone chambers found in Ireland, in Wales, in Brittany, the passage tombs and gallery graves of Atlantic Europe, dating to 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, which is either very significant or a complete coincidence. The mainstream archaeological position is that these structures were built by colonial-era farmers for storage, root cellars, essentially. The similarity to European megalithic structures is coincidental. Colonists from England and Ireland built what they knew, and what they knew happened to look like ancient megalithic structures, because that tradition was embedded in the landscape they came from. This explanation has some merit. Colonial farmers did build stone root cellars. Some of the structures attributed to ancient origins are probably exactly that. But the explanation has problems. Root cellars were usually built into hillsides with access from the front. You want them accessible, and you want the hill to provide an insulation. Many of the Virginia stone chambers are freestanding structures not embedded in hillsides. Some are in locations that make no sense for agricultural storage, on exposed ridge lines, in locations that would be inconvenient for any farming purpose, and some of them are oriented toward significant astronomical events. Solstice sunrises, equinox settings, lunar standstills. Root cellars are not generally oriented toward the summer solstice. The alternative explanations range from reasonable to extremely speculative. reasonable. They were built by indigenous peoples for ceremonial purposes in a tradition we haven't fully documented yet. The archaeological record of stone construction by pre-Columbian peoples in the Virginia mountains is not comprehensive. There may be a tradition of stone chamber construction that we haven't properly identified. Moderate, they were built by pre-Columbian European visitors, Norse, Celtic, Phoenician, or from some other seafaring tradition, who reached the North American coast before Columbus and moved inland. The honest answer is we don't know who built them. The mainstream explanation, colonial farmers, doesn't fully account for all of their characteristics. The alternative explanations range from plausible to wildly speculative. What we do know is that they exist. They are distributed across the Virginia mountains in a pattern that has not been fully analyzed, and nobody has written a satisfying, comprehensive explanation of all of them. They sit in the woods of western Virginia, their stone walls quietly weathering, their orientations pointing toward events in the sky, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Here's a mystery that isn't mysterious at all, except when you think about it carefully. Virginia invented American capitalism, not democracy, not representative government. Those were important. But the thing that made Virginia significant to the global economy, the thing that actually drove colonization and expansion, and everything that followed, was tobacco. John Rolfe, who married Pocahontas, is primarily responsible for this. He experimented with cultivating Caribbean tobacco strains in Virginia soil starting around 1612. By 1614, he was exporting the first commercial shipment of Virginia tobacco to England. By 1617, tobacco was the economic engine of the Virginia colony. By 1620, Virginia was exporting tens of thousands of pounds per year. England's upper class developed a tobacco habit. Virginia met the demand. The Virginia Company's original investors had been looking for gold. They found something worth more than gold in the long run, a legal, addictive agricultural commodity with essentially unlimited demand. The tobacco economy reshaped Virginia and American history in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. It created the plantation system. The plantation system required labor, enormous amounts of labor. Tobacco cultivation is intensive, year-round, requiring many hands working in close coordination. First, that labor was supplied by indentured servants, poor Englishmen and women who sold years of their freedom in exchange for passage to Virginia. But indentured servants served their terms and then became free, and free former servants needed land and opportunity. Virginia was running out of easily accessible land and running out of patience with angry, landless former servants who kept organizing rebellions. The solution, and it was a deliberate solution, constructed piece by piece through legislation, was race-based, hereditary slavery. The tobacco economy is the reason American slavery took the specific form it took. The labor demands of large-scale tobacco cultivation drove the development of the most brutal, most comprehensive system of human bondage in the Western Hemisphere. And here's the part that gets left out of most tellings: the indigenous knowledge behind tobacco cultivation. Tobacco was not a European crop. It was a New World plant. The Algonquian-speaking peoples of Virginia cultivated it. They had developed cultivation and processing techniques over generations. They used it in ceremony, in diplomacy, in medicine. The English learned to grow Virginia tobacco by watching and learning from indigenous knowledge systems. Rolfe's experiments built on what was already known. The varieties he developed, the cultivation techniques he refined, the curing methods he employed, all of this drew on knowledge that existed in Virginia before the English arrived. The indigenous peoples of Virginia had cultivated tobacco for centuries. The English took that crop, commodified it, industrialized its production, and turned it into one of the most profitable agricultural commodities in human history. And the indigenous peoples who had cultivated it? They got displacement, they got war, they got slavery, they got the erasure of their culture and the destruction of their political structures. That's the full tobacco story, the one they don't tell in the Virginia tourism brochures. The crop that built American capitalism was indigenous knowledge, appropriated, industrialized, and turned against the people it came from. That's Virginia in miniature. That's America in miniature. 400 years, dozens of expeditions, and the Lost Colony of Roanoke is still yielding new evidence. The First Colony Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to researching the Roanoke colony, has been conducting systematic archaeological excavation at multiple sites in the Outer Banks and the surrounding mainland for over a decade. What they've found is changing the picture. At the site they call Site X, on the mainland of what is now North Carolina, approximately 50 miles from Roanoke Island, excavations in 2012 and subsequent years found a significant cache of 16th century European artifacts, not trade goods, not items that might have moved through indigenous exchange networks as gifts or barter, items that suggest people were living there, using them, maintaining them. Fragments of a particular type of English pottery, a piece of a surgical instrument, fire pit residue with characteristics consistent with European-style cooking. The artifacts date to the late 16th century. They are in the right time window for the Roanoke colonists. Site X is located near the Chowan River in territory that in 1587 was controlled by the Mungai, a branch of the Chowanokee people. The Chowanokee were, at the time of the Roanoke colony, one of the larger and more powerful nations in the region. They had land, they had food. They were in a position to absorb and support a group of English colonists. The emerging picture, based on the Site X evidence and other recent research, is this. When John White left Roanoke Island in 1587, the colonists had a plan. They were going to move. They split into at least two groups, one going to Croatoan Island to the south, one going northwest to the mainland, to the Chowanokee territory. The evidence suggests at least some colonists built a settlement at or near Site X and lived there for an unknown period of time. What happened after that? How long they survived? Whether they maintained a distinct English identity or gradually assimilated into indigenous communities, whether they eventually died out or left descendants, is still unknown. DNA research is ongoing. The Lumbee Nation in North Carolina, which has long claimed descent from Roanoke colonists, has participated in genetic studies. The results so far are suggestive but not conclusive. There's evidence of European genetic input in Lumbee populations, but the timing and source of that input is difficult to pin down precisely. The archaeology is ongoing. New sites are being identified and excavated. And here's the thing that strikes me most about the Lost Colony story. Virginia Dare was born on August 18th, 1587. If the colonists survived for any significant period, and the evidence increasingly suggests some of them did, she would have grown up speaking Algonquian, learning to grow indigenous crops, learning to navigate the rivers and forests of what is now North Carolina, living a life completely unlike anything her grandfather John White could have imagined when he sailed back to England 10 days after she was born. The first English child born in the Americas probably did not live an English life. She probably became, in some meaningful sense, indigenous to the land. And that story of transformation, of adaptation, of people becoming part of the place they found themselves in, rather than remaking it in the image of where they came from, that's a story that American history has generally not wanted to tell. The lost colony is lost, partly because of the storms and the wars and the accidents of history, and partly because we've been looking for the wrong thing, looking for English people who stayed English, not looking for English people who became something new. The search continues. The ground still has things to tell us, moving to a much more recent chapter of Virginia's hidden history, one that is still, in many ways, incompletely documented. The Underground Railroad in Virginia is not a mystery in the sense that it didn't exist. It absolutely did. Thousands of enslaved Virginians escaped via networks of safe houses, sympathetic conductors, and carefully maintained secrets. What is still genuinely mysterious is the full geography of how it worked. Virginia presented unique challenges for escaping enslaved people. It was deep in the South. Slave patrols were active. The Fugitive Slave Act made even reaching the North dangerous. The state was large, largely rural, and the terrain, mountains, swamps, rivers, worked both for and against people trying to escape. The documented Underground Railroad stations in Virginia are primarily in the northern part of the state: Fairfax County, Alexandria, the Washington, D.C. corridor. The proximity to the free states of Maryland and Pennsylvania and to the District of Columbia made northern Virginia a natural corridor. But escape routes through the mountains, through the Shenandoah Valley, through the Blue Ridge, through the western Virginia highlands are documented in oral histories and escape narratives in ways that don't fully match the physical evidence that survives. There are buildings in the Virginia mountains, in the Allegheny highlands, in the western valleys, where local tradition says escaped enslaved people were hidden. Some of these traditions are backed by historical documentation, some aren't. There are codes that have been preserved, signal systems, quilt patterns hung on fences, lantern placements, systems of communication that were by design not written down, because writing it down could get you killed. This is one of the cases where the absence of documentation is itself historical evidence. The Underground Railroad in Virginia was so carefully hidden, of necessity, that we may never have a complete picture of how it worked. What we do have are the testimonies of people who used it, accounts recorded decades later by formerly enslaved people who escaped through Virginia. Oral histories passed down through families. Some of those testimonies describe Virginia geography in ways that suggest routes and hiding places we haven't fully identified. The search for Underground Railroad sites in Virginia is ongoing. Every few years, a new safe house is documented, a new route is traced, a new piece of the map falls into place. The complete map doesn't exist yet, And some of the people who knew it best, who hid people in their barns, who led escaping men and women through the Blue Ridge passes by night, who knew every stream crossing and every sympathetic farmhouse between Richmond and the Ohio River, those people carried that knowledge to their graves by necessity, by design, because in Virginia, in the decades before the Civil War, knowing too much about freedom could cost you everything. There is growing evidence that the indigenous peoples of Virginia were sophisticated astronomers. This shouldn't be surprising. Astronomy, the careful observation of the sky, the tracking of celestial cycles, the ability to predict eclipses and solstices and the movements of planets, is one of the oldest human intellectual traditions. Virtually every complex society in human history has developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. And yet the astronomy of North America's indigenous peoples has historically been treated as less systematic, less rigorous, less real than the astronomy of ancient Babylon or Egypt or Greece. The evidence suggests otherwise. The Monacan burial mounds along the James River are not randomly oriented. Archaeological analysis has found that certain mound entrances and features are aligned with solstice or equinox sunrise and sunset directions. This is not coincidental. The probability of random alignment producing these specific orientations is astronomically low, pun intended. The stone chambers in Western Virginia that we discussed earlier, the ones nobody has fully explained, many of them share this characteristic. Entrances oriented toward specific solar or lunar events. Capstones positioned to allow a shaft of light to enter the chamber at a specific time of year. This is a pattern seen at sacred sites across the world. Newgrange in Ireland, the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum in Malta, the Sun Dagger site at Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. The builders of these sites understood the movement of the sun and moon through the sky with extraordinary precision, and they encoded that understanding in stone. The Virginia examples are less dramatic than Newgrange, less well documented, less studied. But they're there. The Monacan had a calendar. The Powhatan Confederacy had a calendar. The timing of ceremonies, planting, harvesting, political gatherings, all of this was organized around celestial observation. John Smith's accounts include descriptions of Quiocaros, the priests of the Powhatan religious system, performing ceremonies that were clearly timed to astronomical events. The descriptions are frustratingly vague, because Smith didn't understand what he was seeing and wasn't particularly interested in understanding it. What we can reconstruct from archaeology, from oral tradition and from comparative analysis with other indigenous astronomical traditions suggests a sophisticated sky-watching culture that had been developing for thousands of years. Virginia's night sky, before European settlement, before the light pollution of modern civilization, was extraordinary. The Blue Ridge Mountains provided dark, clear skies. The rivers provided reflective surfaces that could be used for horizon observation. The landscape was in many respects ideal for the kind of naked-eye astronomy that indigenous peoples practiced worldwide. The sky they watched is the same sky that's there now above the Virginia mountains. The knowledge they developed to understand it has mostly been lost, but the stone alignments remain, the mound orientations remain, the physical evidence that someone in the Virginia mountains was watching the sky carefully and building their understanding of it into the landscape. That remains. waiting for people who know how to read it. Let me tell you about a pattern that keeps showing up in the archaeology and folklore of the Virginia mountains, and that nobody has fully explained. Across the Appalachian Range, in Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, the Carolinas, there are traditions in completely separate indigenous cultures that describe ancestors or previous inhabitants who were different from the current population. Not giants, not supernatural beings exactly, something more specific, small, clever people. People who lived underground or in caves, people who had knowledge that the current inhabitants didn't have, people who had been there before and left, or been absorbed, or simply faded away. The Cherokee called them the Nunnehi, immortal spirit people who lived in the mountains and sometimes helped humans. The Monacan and related Siouan peoples had traditions of prior inhabitants of the Piedmont landscape whose identity had been absorbed over generations. The Algonquian peoples of the coast had traditions of being not quite human entities that inhabited specific landscape features. These traditions are not identical. They come from different cultures with different frameworks, but they share a structural element. The mountains were inhabited before the current inhabitants arrived. Someone was here first, and the traces of their presence are still in the landscape. Archaeologically, this is interesting. The Appalachian region does have evidence of very ancient occupation, some of the earliest human presence in eastern North America. The people who lived in these mountains during the Paleo-Indian period, the Archaic period, the early woodland period, were not necessarily the direct ancestors of the nations that were there at contact. There were population movements, cultural transitions, times when one tradition gave way to another, when one group moved or was absorbed or disappeared. The oral traditions that describe prior inhabitants may be genuine, very old memories of those transitions, stories that preserved, across thousands of years, the knowledge that the current inhabitants were not the first. This is speculative. Oral traditions can be very old. There are Australian Aboriginal oral traditions that appear to preserve memories of geological events that happened 10,000 years ago. But connecting specific oral traditions to specific archaeological transitions across thousands of years is difficult. What's less speculative is the convergence itself. Multiple independent cultures in the same mountain range, describing prior inhabitants in similar terms. That convergence tells us something. Maybe that the mountains have a quality, geological, acoustic, something in the landscape that consistently produces experiences that humans interpret as evidence of prior presence. Maybe that the archaeological record really does show population transitions that left enough trace in material culture and ecological memory to persist in oral tradition. Or maybe the mountains of Virginia just make you feel like you're not the first person there. Which, of course, you're not. Nobody in Virginia is the first person anywhere. The ground is too old for that. Let's go back to the Beale Ciphers for a moment, because there's more to say about them. The decoded paper 2, the one that uses the Declaration of Independence as its key, is in many ways the most interesting document in the whole Beale package. Not because of what it reveals about the treasure, but because of what it reveals about whoever wrote it. The encoding method is elegant. Each number corresponds to a word in the Declaration, and the first letter of that word is the letter of the plain text. This is a substitution cipher. Each number stands for a letter. What makes it sophisticated is the variation. The word "the" appears in the Declaration of Independence many times. If you number all the words in the Declaration sequentially, there might be a dozen different numbers that all represent the word "the" and therefore the letter T. This variability makes frequency analysis much harder. In a simple substitution cipher, you can often crack it by looking for the most common symbols, since in English the letter E is by far the most common. With the Beale method, the same letter is encoded as many different numbers, making frequency analysis much more difficult. This is not a naive encoding method. It's the kind of cipher that someone with real knowledge of cryptographic principles would devise for 1820. Professional cryptanalysts who have examined the Beale papers have generally concluded that whoever wrote them had genuine cryptographic sophistication for their era. This either supports the authenticity of the story, Beale was an unusually clever and educated man, or suggests that if it's a hoax, the hoaxer was unusually sophisticated. The search for the key to Papers 1 and 3 has taken many paths. The Declaration of Independence worked for Paper 2. Other founding documents have been tried for Papers 1 and 3. The Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, the Federalist Papers, Washington's Farewell Address. None have worked. The Bible has been tried. Various versions and translations. None have worked. Contemporary books, books that would have been available to Beale in 1820, have been systematically tried. None have worked. Computational approaches have been applied. If Papers 1 and 3 use the same type of key text cipher as Paper 2, then in principle, if you can identify the key text, a computer can crack them in seconds. The problem is that there are essentially infinite possible key texts, unless the key text is something Beale specified in the letter that was supposed to be mailed from his friend, the letter that never came. In that scenario, the cipher is perfectly secure, not because it's mathematically uncrackable, but because the key is genuinely lost. Without the key text, you can't crack it, no matter how sophisticated your approach. $43 million locked behind a letter that was never sent. That's either the greatest unsolved treasure mystery in American history, or the greatest hoax. The distinction, after 140 years, may no longer matter. The Beale ciphers have taken on a life of their own. They are part of Virginia's mythology now, the way the Lost Colony is part of Virginia's mythology. Real or not, they represent something true about the landscape, the sense that Virginia is hiding things, that the surface of the place doesn't reveal everything underneath it, that there are secrets in the hills. Whether those secrets include $43 million in gold is almost secondary. There is a Virginia that no longer exists. A Virginia that was drowned. During the last ice age, the period of maximum glaciation that ended roughly 12,000 years ago, sea levels globally were dramatically lower than they are today. The water that now fills the world's oceans was locked up in continental ice sheets. Sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than modern levels. For Virginia, this meant that the Chesapeake Bay did not exist. The bay is a relatively shallow body of water. Its average depth is only about 21 feet. During the Ice Age, that entire basin was dry land. The rivers that now empty into the Chesapeake, the Susquehanna, the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the York, the James, ran across that dry land and continued east to a coastline that was miles further out than today. People lived on that land. Archaeological surveys along the Atlantic coastal plain have in recent years begun to document evidence of pre-contact habitation in areas that are now underwater, not the deep ocean, but the shallow coastal waters, the bays and estuaries and tidal flats that were dry ground until relatively recently in geological terms. The Chesapeake Bay itself is only about 10,000 years old in roughly its current form. Before that, for tens of thousands of years, the area where the bay now sits was a river valley, an estuary, a coastal plain, a landscape that supported human habitation. Whatever those early Virginians built, whatever camps they made, or ceremonies they held, or stories they told about the land they stood on, all of it is now underwater. There is a Virginia that existed for thousands of years, that was home to thousands of human beings across many generations, and that we will almost certainly never fully excavate or document. The Chesapeake is Virginia's drowned world, the modern bay, with its blue crabs and oyster beds and sailing ships and naval station. It was built on top of a landscape that held human lives before the water came. And those lives are gone. Not just the people, but the evidence of the people, the campsites, the kill sites, the places where someone 12,000 years ago looked out over a river valley and made a fire and told a story. All of it underwater. Virginia's oldest stories are told in silt at the bottom of a bay, and we can't hear them. After everything we've covered tonight, I want to take stock, because the mysteries we've discussed are not all the mysteries Virginia has. They're the ones we know about, the ones with enough documentation or archaeological evidence to tell a coherent story, but Virginia is also full of mysteries we don't know about yet, mysteries that haven't been found or haven't been asked about or haven't been recognized as mysteries because nobody has put together the right pieces. Consider systematic archaeological survey of Virginia has covered only a fraction of the state's total area. The parts that have been surveyed are disproportionately the parts that were most actively developed. The coastal plain, the areas around major colonial settlements, the zones that were in the path of agriculture and industry and road construction. The mountains of western Virginia have been surveyed incompletely. The Allegheny Highlands are archaeologically understudied. The ridge and valley country between the Shenandoah and the Ohio drainage is full of terrain that experienced minimal colonial-era disturbance and has never been systematically surveyed by modern archaeologists. There are things in those mountains, there are things in the ridge and valley country, there are things in the river bottoms and the cave systems and the high meadows that nobody has looked for yet. We know this, not because we've found them, but because of the simple arithmetic of probability. An area with 12,000 years of human occupation that has never been systematically surveyed almost certainly contains significant archaeological material. The question is not whether it's there. The question is what it is. Virginia's cave systems are another largely unexplored frontier. The karst topography of western Virginia, the limestone bedrock that produces natural caves and sinkholes, contains cave systems that have been only partially explored. And caves, worldwide, are among the most archaeologically productive environments. They preserve organic material that would decompose in open-air sites. They were used for ceremony and shelter and burial over long periods, and they're often in locations that weren't disturbed by agriculture. There are almost certainly significant archaeological finds waiting in Virginia's unexcavated caves. And there are the documentary mysteries. Virginia's colonial and antebellum archives are enormous. Thousands of deeds, letters, legal records, church registers, plantation account books. Most of this material has never been analysed with modern historical methods, never been digitized, never been subjected to the kind of systematic analysis that might reveal patterns invisible to individual readers. What's in those archives? What patterns might emerge from systematic analysis? What stories are buried in the account books and the letters and the legal records of 4 centuries of Virginia history? Nobody fully knows. Virginia is 15,000 years of human life, compressed into one state, most of it underground, some of it encrypted, some of it underwater, some of it in archives nobody has fully read. We have been digging at it for 400 years, since the English arrived and started writing things down, and before that, the indigenous peoples were maintaining oral records of their own that are only partially accessible to us now. 400 years of archaeology, 400 years of history, and the picture is still incomplete. It will always be incomplete. But that's not a failure. That's what it means to deal honestly with the past. The past is not a problem to be solved. It's a depth to be appreciated. Virginia is deeper than you think. It's deeper than anyone thinks. Every time someone digs, in the literal soil, in the archives, in the oral traditions, in the encrypted papers, they find more. The ground keeps giving, and the ground keeps secrets. And that's what makes it Virginia. I want to spend a few more minutes on Thomas Jefferson, because Jefferson is, in many ways, the embodiment of the Virginia paradox. And the Virginia paradox is, I would argue, the central mystery of American history. Jefferson was born in Shadwell, Virginia, in 1743. He grew up on a tobacco plantation. He was educated in the best tradition of 18th century Enlightenment thought, Latin and Greek, philosophy and science, law and rhetoric. He was by any measure one of the most intellectually gifted people of his era. He wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776. He was 33 years old. He produced in a few weeks of concentrated writing a document that articulated the philosophical foundation of democratic government with a clarity and power that had not existed before and has rarely been matched since. All men are created equal. They are endowed with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson believed this. He wasn't being cynical when he wrote it. The Declaration is not a piece of propaganda. It's a genuine philosophical statement. Jefferson actually thought that human beings have inherent dignity and that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. He also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime. He inherited enslaved people. He bought enslaved people. He enslaved the children born to enslaved women on his plantation, including the children he himself fathered with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who was also the half-sister of his deceased wife. Sally Hemings could not leave. She could not refuse. She was legally his property. Jefferson never freed her. He freed only a handful of the people he enslaved, and most of those were members of the Hemmings family, and most of those were freed after his death. Jefferson wrote eloquently about the horror of slavery. He knew it was wrong. He wrote that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God was just. He understood clearly and explicitly that a nation built on slavery was a nation building on a foundation of moral catastrophe. And he didn't stop. He continued to enslave people. He continued to benefit from their labor. He used that labor to build Monticello, one of the most beautiful private residences in American history, and to fund the lifestyle of an intellectual gentleman farmer that allowed him to write his great works. This is not a secret. Historians have known this for a long time. The Jefferson-Hemmings relationship was documented in Jefferson's own time and has been confirmed by DNA analysis. What remains mysterious, genuinely mysterious in the sense that historians have not reached consensus on it, is how to understand it. Was Jefferson a hypocrite? Yes, clearly. But calling someone a hypocrite explains nothing. Hypocrites know the difference between what they say and what they do. Jefferson knew. He wrote about knowing. Was he a prisoner of his time and place? Partially. The institution of slavery was so embedded in Virginia society, in the economy, in the social fabric, that individuals who opposed it in principle often found themselves unable to act on that opposition without destroying everything that made their lives functional. But that explanation, while partially true, is also too comfortable. Other people in Jefferson's time and place did free the people they enslaved. George Washington freed his enslaved people in his will, not during his lifetime, but at least at the end. Some Virginia planters freed enslaved people. It was possible. Jefferson didn't do it. The Jefferson paradox is not a mystery with an answer. It's a mystery that generates more questions the longer you look at it. How do you hold in your mind simultaneously? This man produced the most important articulation of human equality in the history of political philosophy, and this man enslaved hundreds of human beings and knew it was wrong and kept doing it. How do you build a national mythology out of a founding figure whose life embodied the central contradiction of the nation he was founding? America has been trying to answer this question for 250 years. It hasn't answered it yet. And Virginia, where Jefferson was born, where he lived, where he wrote, where he is buried on his mountain above the Rivanna River, Virginia is where the question lives. Monticello is a beautiful house. It was built by people who didn't choose to build it. That's Virginia. That's the mystery. That's what the soil is full of. One last thing before we go. People sometimes ask me why I make these videos, why bedtime history, why ancient mysteries, why the stuff that doesn't make it into the textbooks. And I think the honest answer is this. I believe the official version of history, the sanitized, simplified school curriculum version, is not just incomplete. It's actively disorienting. It gives people a false sense of solidity about the past, a false sense that everything has been figured out, explained, settled. It hasn't been. The past is not settled. The past is alive. It is actively being revised, reinterpreted, rediscovered, because new evidence keeps emerging, because new questions keep being asked, because the people whose stories were left out of the official version keep insisting that their stories matter. Virginia is a perfect example of this. The official Virginia story: brave English settlers established the first permanent English settlement in America, overcame hardship, built a democracy, gave the world some of its greatest founding documents. The full Virginia story: 15,000 years of human life before the English arrived, an indigenous empire that was sophisticated, organized, and destroyed. A prophecy that might have doomed two nations, a lost colony that walked off the historical record, a starving time when colonists ate each other, an enslaved workforce that built everything, encrypted treasure maps, sacred mountains, pre-Clovis tools that broke the timeline, mountain people nobody could classify, a valley burned to ash, a founder who articulated human equality while enslaving hundreds of human beings. Both stories are Virginia. Both stories are true. The full story is bigger, stranger, more complicated, more human than the official version, and I think people deserve to know the full story, even at bedtime. Especially at bedtime, because the best time to let the real history in is when the defences are down and the mind is quiet and you're lying in the dark, thinking about everything you thought you knew. That's when Virginia can really get to you. 15,000 years underground, waiting. Sleep well. We'll see you next time.